Computer. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest currently serves as CEO and Director of InnerSense Inc. in Psiometric Science. He is a certified medical technologist, laboratory director, and neuroscientist. He has lectured worldwide on sensory science and vibrational medicine, appearing on CNN, NBC, ABC, Discovery, and others. His work has been featured in Wired, Computer Design, and international media. His book, Harmonic Law, The Science of Vibration, is one of the most complete compendiums of scientific and philosophical knowledge assembled. He is the inventor of Vibrasound, sensory resonance, and his theories include proprietary knowledge and patents in the fields of light, color, sound, music, and algorithmic automata. He has also designed, built, and operated 3 award-winning facilities: InnerSpace, Mindwave, and the AHA Spa. Since 2001, his company InnerSense has partnered with Psiometrics in Glastonbury, England. Together, they have pioneered a new science of universal automata, which defines the physical and mental mechanisms behind the manifestation of intention. They have also designed and constructed a world-class supercomputer that can render a model of any reality in a formal mathematical language. Their work is patent pending. Welcome to the show, Don Estes.
Blessings. Thank you for having me.
Oh, man, it's such a privilege to have you. I remember when you reached out and I looked at your work and I read your bio, and normally I try to shorten it a bit, and I was like, oh my goodness, like you've done so much, and you've been in the game of vibration, frequency, sound, light therapy, basically everything that kind of is starting to hit the mainstream right now. You're one of those pioneers, and you have that amazing chart behind you. You're kind of sharing a little bit with me before when we talked on the podcast. Maybe you can give people a little bit about your background, who you are, and how you got to where you are today, because you've been here for a long time. So it's a real treat to talk to you.
Sure. Yeah. So before I start, let me just say that I love your voice. Has such really great energy to it. We're sort of voice experts here. We have pretty much decided that and determined that it's easier to get who or discover who a person is and what they really want from their voice rather than from their brain or their heart and that sort of thing. So after doing this for years, I've become sort of an expert on voices, so I can listen to a person's voice and tell pretty quickly who they are and pretty much everything about them. So I just wanted to acknowledge that your energy is like really clean and really good.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Good vibration from your voice. So yeah, as you said, I've been around for a long time. We incorporated in 1984. Before that, we had done a lot of work all the way back to when I was in college. The college that I went to was one of a few schools in the world that at the time where the psychology department was based on humanistic and Gestalt kind of technologies or philosophies instead of clinical psychology. So I got a good education on human-machine interfacing and that sort of thing. It was also a school where we were actually making psychedelics in the laboratory before they made all of that illegal. And I actually loved it. I loved that altered state. I loved being able to say, I loved to be able to get up in the morning or come to the realization of how amazing life is. I loved that wow experience. Like, wow, life is amazing. I really wanted to live there. But of course, you discover when you try that there's a compensatory lag time. So you feel really great for a while, but then the next day you don't feel so great. So I had pretty much decided to make that my formal training. The school that I went to allowed me to do that. And I've been one of the few people all this time that has been able to maintain what I learned there during all of that time and bring it into the modern age. So I vowed at that point that I would devote my life to coming up with a way to create that kind of experience without having to pop a pill. That's basically how I got started in all of this. And one of the first things I noticed was that when people did pop the pill, they changed their environment. The very first thing they did was they turned the lights down low, they put on some black lights, they'd surround themselves with colors. So I started working on this theory. I visually called it sensory resonance. And it's basically what happens to your mind when all of the sensory mechanisms get in sync with each other, get into a coherent experience. And when that happens, the reticular activating system of the brain that basically keeps up with all of the security threats and the novelty of checking things out and that sort of thing, it gets out of the way, and the mind can move to higher levels, feelings of peace and well-being and connectedness and all those sorts of things. So I dedicated my life to coming up with a technology that could reproduce those kind of states without having to pop a pill. And so that's how we got started in all of these things, and working with light and sound and color and vibration and aroma and all the other sensory mechanisms. And then when I graduated from college, I actually had to get a job like most people of my generation, and I wound up in medical technology. So I had a really good experience with running hospital laboratories, and I became a chief tech and ran several different hospital laboratories, and I got a really good education in machine human interfacing. How does the human body relate to machines, and how do machines how can they help the human body? And so we sort of got a really early on education with how all of that began to happen. So we started building these kinds of technologies, and that's basically how I got my start.
Well, it's interesting because you know, like I said, I've been kind of in this space a little bit. I would say I'm new to this, and there's a lot of different technologies. I've seen light therapy. I've seen sound lounges, like on your vibra bed. I think that there's a million different ways that we could go with this. We could probably do 3 hours on your book. We could probably do, you know, a couple months on that image behind you that you were sharing, which is some sort of mapped out light spectrum universe. Do you have an idea of like where we could take this as like a linear fashion to get people like a little bit up to date with some of the science and the theory behind how this works and how your work progressed, or how do you see?
Yeah, there's definitely a flow that we can go through of basically a new science that we've created that attempts to explain how intention becomes manifest. So you see a lot of that out there right now, but I've never really seen a science that really describes the mechanism behind how that happens. So that's basically what we've been doing. We've been creating a science that just explains how does a thought or an intention actually manifest itself in the real world. And so there are things that we can talk about there. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I saw some of the slides when we had a little brief conversation last week to kind of get me up to speed on this. And I was like, oh my goodness, like we should have been recording that, because even just trying to gloss over your work, as now you'll see with this image, you're like, okay, you come in hot with like this incredible imagery and yes. So yeah, please go ahead.
So before I say too much more, I better just kind of start off by saying that nothing that I say should be applied to any medical condition. I'm not a medical doctor, and none of the work that we do should be, none of the things that we talk about should be seen as such. In fact, as we go on here, you'll sort of see that we're 180 degrees out of phase with the whole concept of healing, because the old allopathic method of healing says that there's something wrong and you have to find it and fix it. Whereas no one up until recently has been able to find the harmony in things, in brain signals and voice signals and heartbeats and that sort of thing, because to do that, you have to have the fundamental frequency. And without that, you can only get an average frequency. And this is why we believe that so much has been lost in this whole industry of vibrational science, because people have been taking averages of readings rather than finding the fundamental frequency. But when you know how to find the harmony of something, it's much easier to identify what's right about a person and enhance that rather than try to find what's wrong and fix it. So it's a lot better approach, not only for the clients, but also for the therapists themselves. You don't have to dredge through all of the negative things. In fact, we have mathematical proof now with our supercomputer of what happens when you iterate the output of a system back into the input. It geometrically enhances it. So if you get sick and you go to the doctor and you start talking about what's wrong, you're basically iterating the output back into the input. And we have mathematical proof of how it's absolutely impossible for it to ever go away under those circumstances. So we have a whole new paradigm of identifying and enhancing what's right rather than finding and fixing what's wrong. And we believe this is a new paradigm that will generally take over the old paradigm. And everyone sooner or later will start realizing that this is a much better approach to things. In let's see if I find a book. Yeah, so by the time I was finishing up college, I had finished this paper called Sensory Resonance, which is about a state of mind that a person goes into when all of the sensory mechanisms are synchronized and coherent. And in the late 90s, I wrote a book about this called Harmonic Law, which, as you mentioned, is sort of a compendium of scientific knowledge. It's kind of like a encyclopedia, more or less, of vibrational science. And I had thought that when I finished this book, I would know who was right and who was wrong, because pretty much everybody that I had studied under had a different idea about how all this worked and came together. I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of that yourself in the different ideas that people have about how vibration works. But I was more confused than ever when I finished the book, because basically what it was it came down to just an explanation of what they were all saying. And since they were all saying something different, it was still confusing. So I decided that I would chart it out and find out how it all laid out. So this is where this chart came from. So one night when I was sitting in the floor and I had about 40 different illustrations done for my book, I had them all laid out on the floor, trying to arrange them into the right place in the book. And it was almost like I woke up from a dream, and there I find myself sitting in the floor looking down at all these papers, and they were scattered around me sort of like spokes in a wheel. And I find myself being sort of the center hub of a wheel. And I didn't really remember laying them out like that. So I stood up in the room and I looked down at them. And the second that I looked down, I suddenly had this vision that you're seeing now of how it all came together. And it looks very complex, but it's really not all that complex. It's really just an extension of this. This is the standard electromagnetic spectrum that we've all seen throughout our lives. Ever since I was a kid, I was always curious as to how it could be like this. How could reality be such that you could chop it off at both ends with nothing else there? And it just didn't really make any sense to me. So all my life, I've really been looking for, how does that thing terminate at both ends? And when I saw this other vision of it, I realized that it wasn't linear like that. It's actually a cyclical kind of thing where both ends kind of come back together. So what you're really looking at now is really just an expanded version of the linear view of this, that the linear view stops down here at about radio waves and up here at cosmic rays. But I realized from doing all this research that it continues on beyond those two extremes. So at the top end, it continues on to the quantum at the high end, and all the way down to the gravity constant on the low end, where the radio waves turn into sound, ultrasound, and then infrasound, and then pressure, and then finally gravity, and it comes back together on the top end where the cycle repeats itself and comes back together. So once I had this chart, it didn't really obsolete the book, but it somewhat gave me a much bigger view of how everything worked outside of the limited view of this one little view of it here. So you can see here from this chart that this one little octave right here is everything that we know is light. But there's a lot of other vibrations as well. And in fact, on my chart here, you can see that same octave right here as the light octave. And what about all these other octaves? Down here is the sound octave. You can see a 92 key keyboard placed on the chart right there. And then the frequency range of whales and dolphins. And here you see the periodic chart of the elements. And up here you find the primary particles that make up all of the elements. Down here you found sound and motion and pressure, and then finally the astronomical cycles of planets going around stars and going around constellations and galaxies and that sort of thing. And up here at the end, near the end, you see the Milky Way, and you see way out here on the end of the Milky Way, you see our little solar system with the Earth right here. So when I first finished the chart, you know how on a map you always kind of put a place in there where it says you are here on the chart. So I thought it would go right here, right on the little Earth right here. But what I really found out is that it really comes up to being more, see if I can can't seem to get rid of the, oh, there we go, let me move to the bottom. So we're really not, on my chart, we're really not here on planet Earth, we're really here on choice. And so I came to realize that where is a person at in all of this? And it really winds up that we're at choice. We're choosing how to bring all of this together and create it. So this chart basically has a number of different sections to it. The first section is just an introductory to what it's all about. The second section is about how it's down here at the bottom. Actually, I have to move this again so you can see it. It's actually a list of all of the things that prove that reality has its triune nature. There's always two opposites of any given thing, but some third position that resolves the difference between those two extremes. And so this bottom section down here shows the triunity of reality. I think there's something like 50 different correlations between the number 3 and what we know as reality. The fourth section is up here that talks about archetypes of reality. And the fifth section is about dimensions of reality. And so the way the chart works is that these archetypes and these dimensional patterns actually are brought together by choice and get thrown into the crucible of life, which we believe now is a 12-dimensional torus. Sure, you've run into this concept of tori in your research and your the people that you interview.
Yeah. Well, it's the way that I draw a line, like this is definitely way over my head. Just if anybody's looking at this image and you know, kind of processing what they're looking at, it's really extraordinary. But in looking at the different theories, the way that my mind is kind of putting this together from what I've experienced is, you know, when we're talking about the light spectrum, I'm aware that we only get a small fragment of the light spectrum, that there is so much more. You know, we are comprehending, you know, 1% of 100, if that, probably way worse, like 1% of like 1,000. So there's a lot more that we're not experiencing than we are. And the way that you're kind of sharing your map of like, you know, how can it end? And I kind of either see it as, well, like an infinity loop where it comes to a center point and comes back in and out, or like a black hole or something. Like there's no beginning or end of energy. And I don't remember who said it. You would probably know this, but energy can't be created nor destroyed. It's just kind of transmuted in some way. So those are the concepts that my mind is processing what you're sharing. And I'm curious if, you know, the triunity of reality and your little sections here, you might be getting into that, but maybe you can give like a little summary of each one, or maybe you were leading a little bit onto a path that you had laid out, and feel free to go that way if that was the case.
Yeah, basically, as we go through this slideshow, you'll see more of this expanded into all of its different parts. So basically just saying that the sensory mechanisms are spread out across this entire chart. Like light is just this one octave right here that you see of the colors. However, sound is another sensory mechanism that we have. So each one of our sensory mechanisms covers a different part of this whole vibrational spectrum. And the idea would be that ultimately a person would be aware of all of it. We would have sensory mechanisms that would allow us to be aware of everything that's going on in reality. But because our bodies are somewhat limited, we have to use science to get to those other levels. So we've created different kinds of technologies and different kinds of vehicles that allow us to investigate these different areas of reality that we don't really have sensory mechanisms to experience. So I'll just back up just a second here and just show you. This is sort of the a chart that shows the an expanded model of the human nervous system. So pretty much everyone's aware that the human nervous system has this homeostasis in the center, but if it speeds up, it gets into a sympathetic note. And if it slows down, it gets into a parasympathetic state of mind, with homeostasis being in the middle. And you can see up here from brainwave studies how they've discovered that each one of these states of mind that is determined by brainwave state or frequency range has a different effect on people. So you have brain waves that run anywhere from sub-delta up to ultra beta, or what they're now calling gamma. And this has been even expanded since I did the charts. And now we have lambda up here that's even higher than gamma. And we have epsilon, which is lower than sub-delta down here at the bottom. So we have these various brainwave states that are all controlled by the body being able to bring itself back into homeostasis whenever it goes one way or the other. However, whenever the body moves from homeostasis into one of these other states, sympathetic or parasympathetic, the body has to make, or the brain actually has to make a choice between that two. Is this change a threat, or is it a challenge? And this is something that science hasn't really looked into that much, because if you look into the literature, you find that most scientists will call the sympathetic nervous system response the fight or flight response. And whereas that might be true, it's only true when the experience is taken as a challenge. As a threat. If the experience is taken as a challenge, something totally different happens. And I'm sure you've heard of the so-called runner's high and that sort of thing, and sports high that people get into when they're doing games like that, where they're their energy systems are totally sympathetic oriented, but they're not in this fight or flight zone. They're in this different zone, which I call sensory resonance as opposed to sensory dissonance. If you speed up and you're worried or you're anxious or something scares you or something like that, and you take that experience as a threat, you go into sympathetic dissonance. Whereas you take it as a challenge, you go into sympathetic resonance. And this is basically the bottom line to all of the technologies that we've discovered is how do you get a person to balance out their nervous system? And what we find is that either way you go, sympathetic or parasympathetic, homeostasis tries to bring you back to normal. So even if you, like for example, if you go to sleep, if you go parasympathetic and you go back to sleep sooner or later, the brain makes norepinephrine and wakes you back up again. Same thing on the sympathetic end. If you are a good example of that would be having a sexual encounter with someone and how the blood pressure goes up and the heartbeat goes up, and you definitely go into a sympathetic nervous system reaction. But upon orgasm, you get pulled back to homeostasis. You get really sleepy and everything. So there's this mechanism that's built into the system to keep us from going too far in either direction. The only way we have found that you can go significant distance in either direction is to go both directions at the same time. And we discovered that this is something that the Zen masters have learned to do. They've learned how to become extremely relaxed but be inspired at the same time. And if you do that, if you promote that kind of experience for yourself, you find that you can go extremely far sympathetic and extremely far parasympathetic until you actually work your way all the way back around this chart to both ends, to where you get self-mastery on this end and you get self-realization on the other end. Otherwise, if you just try to go one way or the other, you wind up being pulled back into homeostasis, which is down here in the middle somewhere. So after I did this, once I discovered this theory of what I call sensory resonance, I started building practical technologies from it. But the first thing I learned is that there's a pharmacy inside of our head, and we're the pharmacist. We're capable of writing a prescription to feel any way we want to feel. But most people won't do that. Most people allow some situation that they're in or some other person or whatever like that to write the prescription. So we wanted to develop technologies of teaching a person how to write your own prescription to control the pharmacy that's in your brain. And the first thing that we did was, or the first thing that I did was I created technology that would allow a person to get into that advanced state of mind. And I call this Vibrasound. It's really a sensory, what people are calling now a sensory resonance vehicle that allows you to see, hear, and feel any kind of signal like music or voice or musical instrument or anything like that. So the idea would be that a person would lie down on this table. This table is filled with a liquid crystal mattress, which is sort of a colloidal mineral solution that matches the body's sound characteristics, so that when someone lies down on this mattress, it basically turns their body fluid into a speaker, such that any kind of sound that you put through it or vibration that you put through it basically feels like it's coming right out of the body, rather than like someone's laying on something that's vibrating. So most of these sound tables and sound lounges that you're talking about that are out there on the market right now, they have that one little drawback in that there's an impedance loss between moving a vibration from one material into another material. So when you lie down on something that's got speakers in it or something like that, you basically, it feels like you're laying on something that's vibrating. Whereas with this particular technology, it actually feels like it's generating inside of your body and coming out. So we created this Vibrasound system, and over the years we added things to it. We added colors and light and I'm sure you're familiar with the light and sound devices that are out there now that flash lights in your eyes. And we have pioneered that since the 70s. So we've been doing this for a long, long time. We're now in our 13th generation. So we've learned all about the right signals to use, the right waveforms to use, that sort of thing that allows our technology to be just one step ahead of what you normally see out there. So very sophisticated light and sound devices and color devices and virtual reality devices, such that there's a screen mounted above this bed so that we can project things there. So any of our quantum biofeedback technologies can be projected there. Our 3D virtual reality can be projected there, so you can have people swimming with dolphins or flying through Mayan pyramids or anything like that with their eyes open. But at some point, they're asked to close their eyes, and at that point, the other device takes over and uses the closed eyelid as a projection screen. And it becomes sort of like a lucid dream, only it's a waking dream. So you find yourself flying over landscapes or things like that, or in somebody else's house, or some almost ethereal, dream-like experience that you're fully conscious in. You're not really along for the ride, you're there consciously. So we worked on this until the late 80s and early 90s. We get out and we tried to start marketing this to different doctors and that sort of thing, and was really surprised to find that they wanted proof of what it was doing and how it was working. And I was like, well, you know, music and sound has like at least a 2,000-year history of being efficacious for shifting people's moods and making them feel better, or even healing them. But they're saying, no, you're doing this, you're doing different things, and you've got them all combined together, and we don't know really what's happening there, so you need to go back and prove that. So that's basically where the book came about. I stopped everything, I shut everything down. I went around the world and I apprenticed under everybody that I could find that had anything to say about vibrational science. And I wrote the book. And then when I wrote the book, I realized that there were still discrepancies in what everyone said. So I decided to do a flow chart of the book. And this is basically what I came up with then. And this gave me such a big, huge picture of what's going on that even though it didn't really obsolete the book, it sort of made the book, to me, insignificant, because everything that's in the book is now on the chart. So now when I go to do lectures, I only take the chart. I don't have to take my 400 books with me to explain where all of this came from. But with doing this and laying it out this way, I started to get a concept of how does this thing terminate at both ends. And you can look at it a lot of different ways. The scientists would pretty much agree with me that at one end it's the quantum and at the other end it's gravity. In fact, this is the big thing now in physics, is they're trying to resolve the difference between the mathematics of the quantum world and the mathematics of the gravity world. And they call this the unified field theory. And many people are looking for it, but the reason they can't find it is because all of their studies of it are out here in relative space, what I call relative cosmic reality, where everything is relative by frequency. Whereas really the only way you can resolve what's happening at both ends is to look at the absolute nature of what's going on. Where does all of this come from? Where does this quantum unit come from? And where does gravity come from? And you have to start looking at that, and you find out that it's almost like this is God in the Bible, where it says that God has the universe stretched like a curtain. And you can see one hand is here and the other hand is here, and it's all stretched out like this. But this is just relative reality. What about the absolute nature of reality that causes all of this to happen? So this is one of the areas of research that we got into, is defining what absolute reality was all about. And this is why I wound up calling the chart the absolute scale of relative cosmic reality. because it's basically a chart of everything that we know that's relative by vibration, held together by absolute archetypes that that come together to create all that is. So, here we go. So a closer look at this chart, you can see other things that you could call those terminations. You could call it, for example, one is the whole and the other is the parts. If you look back at the chart, you can see around here, this is the wholeness of everything. Here's a galaxy, for example, the Milky Way galaxy, that is made up from all of its subcomponents. It's constellations and stars and planets, and the humans that are within it, and the things that make up the humans, the organs and the tissues and the cells and the molecules and the atoms and the primary particles that make it all up. So you can kind of start seeing that over here we have the wholeness of everything, whereas over here we have the parts that make up the whole. So that's another way of looking at how it terminates. One of my favorite ways of looking at it is player versus the instrument. We live inside of this instrument. The whole universe is an instrument, but there's also a player of the instrument. So we're not only living inside this instrument, but we're also the player of the instrument. And when I first did the chart, we were looking for ways of identifying what these things were. We kind of came up with the same conclusions you did. It must be infinite and zero, right? At one end of this chart, there must be zero frequency, and at the other end, there must be infinite frequency. But when we were trying to use algorithms with our supercomputer to prove that, it kept just saying, no, that's not the way it is. And so we were trying to put every kind of equation in there, 0 plus 1 equals infinity, or minus 1, or divided by 1, and it kept saying, no, no, no. So we finally came back and we said, well, we did an algorithmic modeling, and we asked the supercomputer, well, how does it terminate at both ends? And the first thing it said is that there's no such thing as infinite and zero. And we were like stunned by that statement and asked it to explain that. And it said that the reason why there's no such thing as infinity is because as human beings look out into the universe and they see all these objects out there, we decide, or we make up come to this conclusion that it is a universe that's full of infinity. It's full of infinite number of things. But that's really not true. It's really just one thing. And as we look out there and we see all these different objects, we're looking just at one thing that has divided itself into everything that we see. So the universe is more infinitesimal than it is infinite. It's one. All of these different objects that you see out there are some divisions of that one. And also, there's no such thing as zero, because if you take the one away, you don't wind up with zero. You wind up with minus one. And this is something that has plagued our math and our understanding of math ever since it got started. And that's a whole other workshop or seminar that we could get into. There is talking about the math and how math is really the language of the universe. It even goes beyond that to where it's not really the math, it's really the harmony. Harmony is the language of the universe, but it works according to mathematical principles. And here we have this math boiling down to saying that at one end of this scale, you have the square root of 1, which stands for everything that's real in the universe. And at the other end, you have the square root of minus 1, which stands for everything that's potential or imaginary in the universe. So you start really kind of start getting an idea of what this chart is really trying to tell us is that at this end, you find everything that is already actualized in reality. Whereas this end, you find everything that's still hidden in potential. And everything that you see out there, every person, every object is partly actualized, but partly still hidden in potential. And this is the life that we live in. And so as this begins to work around, as the quantum begins to express itself, the quantum becomes elementary particles that become atoms, that become molecules, that become cells, that become tissues, that become organs and organisms, and finally superorganisms like humans and stars and star systems and galaxies and that sort of thing. So, there we go. So one of the easiest ways to understand the chart is it basically just describes the universe as actual versus potential. Everything that we know is partly actualized, but partly still hidden in potential, just like we are, just like a human being is, just like you are and I am. We're both actualized to some degree, but we also still have a part of us that's hidden in potential. And where is that? That's over here on the other side, in this absolute world, which the scientists are now starting to call the reciprocal universe. If anything over here in the actual direct space that we live in, any real thing, is not its true whole self, is 100% true self, it has a reciprocal self still existing on the other side. And this is the part that we're after. We're after this part of a person that is still in potential, and how do we help them release that potential? So that's how we really got started in all of this, is as a goal and a purpose, is how do you help a person realize that they're only partially actualized and that they still have a lot hidden in potential. And in studying the math of this, we actually made some amazing discoveries. This one is basically the crux of our work, which is this equation here. It's called the wave equation. This isn't something that I've made up. This is the standard accepted equation, scientific equation for what causes a wave, a sound wave, a light wave, any kind of wave phenomenon. That's not just a single wave. It's called a complex wave. And this is the equation that defines the wave. And it says that the complex wave equals the real times the cosines times the frequency, plus the imaginary times the sine waves times the frequency. Now you can go online and you can do a search for sine and cosine, and you'll get millions of hits on it. In fact, you probably remember it from school. They tried to teach us a little bit about this in high school in trigonometry. Unfortunately, they didn't really teach us what it had to do with waves. They only taught us what it had to do with right triangles and hypotenuse and tangent and all that confusing stuff. Had they taught us what it had to do with waves, then I might not be sitting here now having to explain all this to everybody of what they really do have to do with waves. But if you go online and you do a search for real and imaginary, you don't get anything. You don't get any explanation of that whatsoever. So we got very curious about this, and we started asking physicists and mathematicians, what are those? What's the real and the imaginary in that equation? And their response was always the same thing. Those are mathematical functions that are required to solve the wave equation. What? No, what are they? Well, they are mathematical functions that are required to solve the wave equation. It's like, no. They have to mean something. They have to come from somewhere. How do you determine them? How do you get them? Where do they come? What are they? Nobody seemed to know. I was blown away. This was about 20 years ago that we made this discovery. And so we made this the primary objective, is to determine what are these real and imaginary coefficients in this equation. And in the process of doing that, we were trying to, as I mentioned, solve the infinite zero problem. And we had gone into the supercomputer and asked it, and it said there's no such thing as zero or infinity. And so we asked it to come up with an equation that would describe how these two ends relate to each other. And it came up with this equation that you see here, the square root of +1 taken to the power of the square root of -1 equals 1. So we asked the supercomputer, what does that mean in English? And basically reading the algorithmic functions of it, it basically said this, that any real thing, which is notated by the square root of +1, any real thing taken to the power of its own imagination results in unity and wholeness. And I thought that was really a mind-blowing kind of assumption for a computer to make. So I really wouldn't call this computer a personality, but it is some type of an entity that seems to have an understanding that that we really can't easily come to with our own imagination, because it requires too much really heavy-duty math to really do it. So we need these supercomputers really to figure all of this out. So it called this the grand unification of real and imaginary. And we started realizing that what's really at both ends of this scale is real and imaginary. At the left side, it's everything that has actualized and become real, whereas at the right end, it's everything that still lies in potential and is purely imaginary. So in further results or further work on this, we came up with other ways of viewing this. If you view it from a polar view like this, you can see that how the present origin is right here in the center in this little dot, and time is moving this way. This is the past back here and the future up here. And this whole crosshair is kind of moving along through time. And if you were to plot frequencies on here, in fact, the physicists and the scientists do this all the time, to where they call this the S-plane, and they plot their frequencies and whatnot on here. But each frequency has a sine and a cosine component, so that this time domain plane becomes the cosine plane, and the vertical plane becomes the imaginary sine wave plane. And they have to use this to plot all of their frequencies and whatnot on. Whereas we were really more concerned about it as how do we determine these things in a human being? How would you, I mean, it seems reasonable that you could determine the actual parts of a person, but how do you determine the imaginary parts of a person? That just seems impossible. So in viewing this and looking at this further, we basically realized that the answer was in this equation right here, to where the complex wave equals the reals times the cosine plus the imaginary times the sine wave. So we started doing all kind of research into that and making amazing discoveries about it. But to just step back and just summarize just a little bit, you can see that basically everything that I've talked about so far has come down to two major discoveries. The discovery of sensory resonance and what happens when you synchronize all of the sensory mechanisms. And this fact of real and imaginary ratio representing the signals that people are putting out, their brain waves, their heartbeats, their voice patterns. So these two major discoveries have been brought together, and we've tried to find applications in different fields regarding this discovery. And it has applications in a lot of different fields, in education and different kinds of vibrational therapy and biofeedback and entertainment, audio and video enhancement, water structuring, computer design and programming. It had this discovery of real and imaginary ratio has applications in all of these different fields. I'll give you some examples of it. These are the main features of the chart that you're seeing there. It's a logarithmic scale and cosmocartogram of universal reality, how the universe is laid out. The theory of everything. How does art and science and spirituality all come together into one view? How absolute archetypes relate to relative associative reality. It talks about the spiritual hierarchy of the universe, about ascending and descending models of divinity. It talks about the mathematical model of universal unity and diversity. It talks about the cycle of manifestation, about how you first have a thought that has to be expressed, and then you take action on the expression, and there it manifests itself. So there's manifestation goes through this cycle. It also has an expansion of the standard electromagnetic spectrum that goes way beyond the standard idea of having it stop at radio and cosmic rays, and actually has 18 bands of relativity. I can show you here, like if you look at the bottom here, you see all these different ellipses. One of those is a different band. This outside one, this purple one, is time. So if you to follow that around here, you see all of the different, if you could read all the small print, you can see all the things that have happened back in history, going back through history. So one of these is time, but it also charts frequency and octave and sounds and all of the primary measurements like mass and density and temperature and all that sort of thing. So there's like 18 different bands of relativity that are shown on the chart. It talks about the triune nature of reality that we talked about. This area over here basically shows 10 different kingdoms of reality that have evolved over time through the various different segments. So you've got force that becomes particles that become atoms and molecules, and then cells and tissues and organs and organisms. But this actually shows, this area over here actually shows how each one of these goes through 7 stages of process before it becomes the next stage. So atoms go through 7 stages of process to become molecules, and molecules go through 7 stages of process to become cells, and cells through 7 stages to become tissues, and so forth and so on. So you can basically begin to see how these numbers that have always been so elusive to us, the number 10, the number 3, the number 7, the number 12, you start really beginning to see why those are so important and how they all relate to each other. It also talks about this other side of the chart is communication and music microstructure. So over here, I've broken down every different subcomponent of music, like the time signature and the numerator and the denominator of the time signature, and the different kind of instruments that are used, and the different kind of waveforms that are used, and everything. I think there's something like 50 different microstructures of music. And here I've broken those all down, and I've shown what happens when you modulate that particular thing, when you modulate that in music. So a musician would be able to take this information over here and create designer music from it. How do you make a piece of music that has this particular feeling to it? Well, all you do is you modulate one of the different, or one or more of the different structures of the music itself, and creates that particular experience. And then there's a number of different models of cosmology and atomic structure and human energy fields and all of that that the chart basically shows too. So I show you, like right here, you can't really see it, but this purple that you see right here is actually a statement of the looking at this whole thing as an atom. and where it has these 7 levels around it, and what's happening to the electrons and that sort of thing, and those 7 different levels. It could also be used as a model to describe the human body, to where here you have the core self, and you have the casual bodies and the mental bodies and the spiritual bodies located around the core self. So the chart basically is showing a lot of different things, a lot of different models of the same thing, but they all kind of relate to each other because they're all in that one cyclical kind of structure. And from that, we've basically created a number of different technologies, knowing about these different things. And so we have technologies that resulted from our work in sensory resonance. So here you see a picture of my wife laying on one of our vibrasound wave tables. We also have that same thing as a massage table, or as a reclining chair, or now we actually have it as a little pad that'll fit into any kind of chair that allows you to feel the music. But we also have other technologies that allow you to see the music. So this is our latest technology up here, the sensorium sensory interface that can generate, synchronize, and program any known kind of vibrational therapy. So it can generate flashing lights, colors, frequencies, different tones, different waveforms, vibrotactile vibrations, aromas, electromagnetic fields. Any kind of vibrational phenomenon can be generated by this piece of software. And then it will synchronize and program those so that you can set up segments of time and say, for the next 30 seconds, I want it to do these 107 different things. And then at the end of that, I want it to switch over to segment number 2, and I want it to do those 107 things. So you can stack on segments to create a timed program with this and create any kind of vibrational therapy that you want. We also have very sophisticated quantum biofeedback technologies that I call them quantum biofeedback technologies, but actually they're pre-quantum biofeedback technologies because they show what's happening with these real and imaginary components, which are discrete components that exist on the other side of the quantum veil in reciprocal space. So we created a number of different biofeedback technologies that allows a person to see and hear and feel what they are on the other side as a pattern before it becomes a vibration on this side. And that's led us into other little discoveries. One of our latest things is called Cyfidelity Sound, which is a discovery that we made when we were playing music back through the quantum biofeedback technology, and found that the display, you can see the display here of where the horizontal plane is the cosine plane and the vertical plane is the imaginary sine wave plane. And we played music through our quantum biofeedback technology and watched this screen go flatline. And so all of the sine waves disappeared, only the cosine waves were showing. And so we started studying that, and we made another major discovery of why a recording never sounds like a live performance, because half of the music is gone. Because when you're listening to a live performance, these real and imaginary components are flying all over the room, and the listeners are able to reassemble that inside their head. And they actually get the phase space of the environment that they're listening in. But when that same song is recorded in a multi-track studio, there's no environment there. So some guy named a sound engineer has to sit down and use different kinds of stereo tricks to artificially create an environment. So they use reverb and panning and echo and things like that to simulate the actual, whereas this little piece of software right here can just recreate the environment. So you hear the phase space of the environment along with the music, and it's mind-blowing to listen to this listen to your music with this, because you would never go back to listening to regular stereo once you hear it in its full form here. And from there, we've just expanded into other things. We have new biofeedback technology that actually feeds your own brain waves back into the vagus nerve. So I don't know if you're familiar with all of that that's going on with the vagus nerve and that sort of thing now, but it's becoming the next big thing in neurotechnology. And so we've created all these different technologies using those two major discoveries. This is sort of a picture of my latest studio. You can see one of my daughters now laying on one of these sounds, and then the ceiling up here becomes the screen that can either play the videos or eyes open technology. And if you close your eyes, there's another technology takes over that turns that ceiling into a light and sound device. So you have this really amazing eyes closed kind of visual experience. This is what we call a sensory matrix, or a spectral matrix from a person's voice. So we can do this not only with the voice, but we can do it with their thoughts as well. But what you're looking at right now is an XY graph, a Cartesian graph, to where I've taken my own voice and I've spoken into this. And instead of seeing a vibration, you can see the pattern that vibration makes on the other side when it's just real and imaginary components. Keep it in mind that the horizontal cosine plane is the actual real, and the vertical plane is the imaginary sine wave components. And each one of these pixels that you see here is one of the real or imaginary components that was in my voice when I made the statement that made this matrix. So we can do this with a person's stated intentions, or we can do it from their thoughts with a little mind band that goes around their head. And at the same time, we get a number of real-time, what we call state of being indicators that can tell us where a person's at in real time there. So we can see the distribution between real and imaginary and complex. We can see the distribution between physical and mental and spiritual. We can see the frequencies that are there and what kind of music notes that those are. We can see the frequency range. We can see where they're at in the manifestation cycle and how much energy they have, and whether it's flowing into them like a black hole or if it's flowing out of them like a white hole. So there's a number of different things that we can determine from viewing these spectral matrices. We've also built a number of facilities. We call them entertainment, INNER, entertainment facilities, where we've basically married the neurotechnology to virtual reality so that we don't have to call it therapy. So we can go into a city and we can set one of these domes up, and we can do this work with people without actually having to call it a therapy, to where they get the benefits of the technology, all under the guise of entertainment and having a good time. This is like a close-up of the sci-fi sound processor that I mentioned to you. It has 3 different transforms on it. We made these for DJs, so you can mess with the music a little bit and get all kind of psychoacoustic effects from using this. And then this screen can be projected onto a dome screen or a larger screen. So it becomes really the only audio visualizer that we're aware of that actually shows the mathematics of the music itself. So it's not like the iTunes visualizer where you're just taking a known geometry and you're vibrating it to sound or whatever. This is actually drawing the real and the imaginary components of the music directly onto the screen. This is sort of an idea of how it works here. This is what the screen looks like if you're running just an MP3 through it, which is just all cosine. Everything just goes on the cosine plane. Whereas if you run a wave file through it, you can see how there's a little bit of imaginary there, but it's all forced onto the cosine plane. Whereas with sci-fi, you can see how that's been opened up, and you get both the horizontal plane and the vertical plane actually showing sound, and you can actually see the sound as well as hear it and feel it. This is a screenshot of the device that we call the Peak Alembic, which is a device that basically takes the sound from a person. It basically just takes it right out from the earphones that we're sending to the person. We're asking the person to resolve the difference between the real and the imaginary components of their own voice. We just take those and take it loose from the headphones and bring them all the way over to this device, and we hook the two wires up to these two 24-karat gold wave guides that are suspended into our reaction chamber. And we ask water to do the same thing that we're asking the person to do, which is to resolve the difference between those two components. And here you can basically see it in action, where all we're doing is putting sound into those two gold rods, but it's causing the water to cavitate and implode inward on itself and go to its next highest level of order, which for water is vapor. For a human being, it would be spirit. But the metaphor here is that the water goes through the same process of acknowledging the need to change, giving up the resistance, removing the unwholesomeness from itself and purifying itself, and then stepping out to the next level, which is this purified water over here. So we bottle this and have a person drinking, and it's the most amazing technology we've ever dealt with. It's mind-blowing. And then finally, this is just a graphic of our supercomputer and how we've been able to use the discoveries we've made to actually improve computer design, such that instead of reading information from a computer using ones and zeros, long numbers of ones and zeros, it's easy to understand that that number could actually be seen as a fraction rather than a whole number. So we can place any number on the music scales between 1 and 0. Instead of having them be a 1 or a 0, it can be any number between 1 and 0. And that's basically how this supercomputer works. It's basically a hybrid computer that has both a digital component and an analog component, and a computer in the middle that basically marries the two together. So you can, these analog computers are so much more powerful than digital computers that people moved away from them a while back because they're very expensive. Just the card for ours cost like $300,000 just to produce the card that actually drives it. But from all of that, we've basically been able to create a number of different vibrational types of products that are now on the market, and we're in like 20 different countries. I have about 200 to 400. I don't know really for sure, somewhere between 200 and 400 of these out in 20 different countries right now. So basically, that's kind of an overview of who we are and what we're doing, what our technology looks like, and that sort of thing.
Holy crap. Oh my God. Oh my God. My brain is just trying to keep up with what you were sharing. It's really mind blowing. I could go 100 different ways with this and listen to you talk all day. I think that, on the one side, which is not my skill set, I think that somebody could explore the science with you forever. It's really fascinating. What I am more curious about and know a little bit more about is how would I apply this to, I'm going to just throw a lot of stuff at you, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want. Because what it made me think about, when you're talking about the real and the imaginary, I feel it's a little bit about the idea of like integrating the shadow, or having the potential of being human. Anything that the imagination space, I could imagine this realm that exists, and I can move towards that potential reality through my actions and through my own free will choices. The other thing that it makes me think about is simulation theory that's been coming up a lot. God and the nature of consciousness, because consciousness in itself is a mystery. They don't know the origins of consciousness, and you've been looking at this with your chart. It's just mind-blowing. So I'm just curious, with the research that you've done and looking at all of this science, for me, if I don't have the technologies would be cool and I'd like to use them. I definitely have to figure out how that can happen. But from your understanding and doing all this research, what are your thoughts on just, moving up the ladder and expanding consciousness, creating a relationship with God, if you believe that exists, or that expansiveness exists? Because you started the beginning with talking about, psychedelic states. And in that state, you experience, let's say, a different realm that's non-ordinary. It's just not your everyday consciousness. And so if you could produce that state with technology, that would be interesting. But if you could expand your awareness, even better. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that general overview? And then maybe some of the stuff that's been happening with people using their technology. What are they experiencing? What happens when you use it? And like the one specific would be the Fidelity. If you're like an electronic music maker or you make music, is that a technology you would use as well to enhance the quality of your track?
Yes. Yeah, sure. So ever since I started this back in the 60s and 70s, I've wanted to call this or refer to it as spiritual technologies. However, I've really never been able to do that because most of the time I'm presenting to medical doctors or scientists or whatever that don't really understand how all that relates to each other. If I go back up to my chart here, the scientists are really only interested in this relative part of reality. They're not really interested in this absolute part of reality, because to get in there and talk about that, you do have to talk about universal archetypes, or we have to talk about origin and destiny as opposed to just history of the universe. And God forbid you have to maybe talk about God. And that really throws them a curve. So there's not really many scientists that I can sit down and have this conversation with. I really wanted to call the Vibrasound and its related technologies spiritual technologies ever since we began. But I've only recently been able to refer to that. And the first step away from that is to, instead of talking about spiritual technologies, we can talk about consciousness technologies. But there's a huge difference between a consciousness technology that allows you to enhance your mindfulness or your awareness of things and what's going on around you. There's a huge difference between that and a technology that would actually put you into a state of mind where you could have a spiritual experience. And so only recently have I been able to really talk about this. And just in this past year, I've given 3 or 4 different presentations on this, mostly to online summits. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Spiritual Technology Summit that goes on every year. So I was a part of that. And then there was a recent one too. The lady over in Glastonbury put on another spiritual kind of summit where we were able to talk about this technology in terms of spiritual reality. But it gets difficult in talking about that because of, you don't want to step on too many people's toes, because even within the spiritual community, you have all these different ideas about how things work. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that religion is the greatest cause of problems on the planet right now. And so it's hard to talk about the difference between spirituality and religion, whereas religion is a personal relationship with the divine. Whenever you turn around and you try to explain what you just experienced to somebody else, that becomes philosophy. It is not religion anymore. But people make it so. People have all of these groups where they get together and they get these group minds going of how they all believe the same thing about the same thing. That's what turns into religions, whereas spirituality is really about true religion. It's about a person's own private, individual experience with the divine. That's really what our work is all about. And even though I can't really tell most people that, the idea when I lie somebody down on one of our vibrasound tables, the main idea is to put them into a state of mind to where they have an epiphany or an aha moment, to where they suddenly realize the vastness of universal reality and how it's all connected and that sort of thing. But this really gets us back to what you were talking about earlier about how does that really all work. And we are not our animal bodies. We're not our animal selves. And we are not our spiritual selves. We are some kind of consciousness that's sandwiched in the middle of that, having to choose between those two things. So it's kind of like the old cartoons where whenever the character had to make a big choice, a little angel appears on one shoulder and a little devil appears on the other shoulder. And they both start going at you. Well, we're neither one of those things. We actually have to, we're this consciousness that's sandwiched in the middle that has to choose between what those two things are telling us to do. So your animal self say, wow, that looks really cool. I really want to go do that or try that. But your spiritual self may step in and say, whoa, wait a minute, just back up a little bit. You need to think that out a little bit more before you jump into that. So it's always this balance between our consciousness having to resolve the difference between the animal self and the spiritual self. And those are really just other words that we would use for what we called real and imaginary before. So we have this real part of ourselves that's already actualized, but we have this imaginary spiritual part of ourselves that has not actualized itself yet. So any decision that we make has to be made from that conscious state in the middle of those two, having to choose between what they say. And this can get us off into a whole other area. There is like, what is the soul? Because in our opinion, the soul is nothing more than the decisions that your consciousness has made to choose spirit over animal. So any experience that you have where you've chosen the spirit over the animal goes into a little file, and that little file is what survives death. When you wake up on the other side, you wake up knowing all of those things, all of those spiritual realities that you've experienced throughout your life. So that's basically how our technology fits into the whole thing about spirituality, is it's about realizing that you're not that. You're not your spirit self. You are this consciousness that is choosing the spirit over what the animal has to say about it. And in regards to your other question about, let me get back here to this, the high fidelity sound. As I mentioned to you, if you ever listen, do you listen to your music on your phone?
Yeah, I usually have headphones.
Yeah. So if you were to put this app on your phone and listen to your music this way, you would never go back to regular stereo because it sounds so flat and so dull and so artificial. We're not even aware that it sounds like that until you sound what it's supposed to sound like. live, and then you suddenly become aware of how different it is when it gets stereoized. But we have a lot of people now mastering their albums with it. We have bands that are using it live. It actually works better live than it actually does on recordings. So it's just a new way of expanding our experience with music, which has really, unfortunately, gone the other way over the past 20 years or so. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, we would cram as many speakers as we could afford or find into a room. And any new processor that came out that improved the quality of the sound, we would go and we would get it. And we listened to music. Do you know that people don't even listen to music anymore? It has become so degraded that most people just use it as a background sound. They're not really listening to the music. In fact, we discovered this when we paid a company in Vancouver $10,000 to go do a study on this app that we were about to release. And they came back and they said, well, if you release that app, you're going to have to give it away. You can't charge for it. And I said, well, that's just not going to happen. I've got like millions of dollars tied up in all of this. Why would I have to give it away? And they said, because nobody cares. And I was, no, you got to be kidding. I cared greatly about music. And they said, yeah, but nobody else does. And they showed me on their report. It really it almost made me quit, honestly, after seeing this report, because this report said that less than 1% of people who are listening to music on their phones are even listening to the music. They've actually got the music on to block everything else out. And they're using the music just to kind of block everything out to where they don't have to listen to what everybody else has to say or the room noise or anything like that. But they're texting, they're talking to friends, they're doing their homework, they're doing other things, and they're not really listening to the music. And to me, this is extremely sad because music is the most powerful thing in the known universe. And the fact that it's been so degraded, and now everybody goes and downloads off of iTunes, where the quality of the music itself has been degraded to the point to where you're only getting a fraction of the original. And without the whole thing, you're missing parts of what's going on there. In fact, you're missing the most important parts, which are the spiritual parts of the music that are always on the higher frequencies that get chopped off with all these compression methods. So we think that this high fidelity sound is one of the greatest technologies we've ever created, but we've had a lot of pushback in the industry getting it out there because the sound engineers don't like that it changes everything that they've done. And it takes away all that artificial stuff and replaces it with real information. And the sound engineers, basically these days, they consider themselves as much of the artistry of an album as they do the artists themselves. And so they don't take kindly to someone coming in and saying, hey, you don't really need all of that. You don't need all of that artificial stereo stuff. You can just master with high fidelity sound and it sounds like you're in the room with the band. But since this is their livelihood, they haven't taken kindly to that. So we've had some pushback on getting the technology out into the field. So what we finally realized is that this is an end user technology. It's not something for the record companies or that sort of thing. It's an end user. It needs to be on everybody's phone, and it's you that gets to decide, do you want to listen to this the way it sounded when it was recorded in a studio, or do you want to listen to it in a way that makes it sound like you're listening to it live? And so we're thinking that hopefully that once this gets out there, that people will start demanding it. And then that way it will backtrack its way into the sound studios and movies and all the other things to where sound is so important. So
Amazing.
that's just
Yeah.
a basic overview of the spiritual applications of the technology. We were actually going to sell the sci-fi because it's not really our marketplace. Music and audio is really not the marketplace we were after. But the more we got to working with it, the more we realized that it has psychoacoustic effects on its own. And it does lead a person into more spiritual receptivity of the information being processed. So it not only has applications in music, but it has applications in education and lecturing, or anytime sound is used, where it actually engages the listener like they've never been engaged before. So instead of just listening to music, the music is actually separated into these real and imaginary components, and one goes to one speaker and the other goes to the other speaker. And the listener themselves has to resolve that inside their own brain. So this is work that a person has to do that they've never had to do before to listen to music. So it engages them in ways that they've never been engaged before. And we haven't proven it, but we're in the process of doing the research to show that it improves cognition and understanding of the material being presented and memory retention and those sorts of things. So all of our technology, I believe, has this connection to spiritual awareness that we believe is probably the most primary goal that it has, is to increase the spiritual awareness of people by getting them to realize that they are not as aware of the world and what's going on as they really need to be. We've all been kind of dumbed down, and our minds have been quietened down by all of the technologies that have robbed us from the original information. And we find that true not only in music, but we find it in biofeedback, for example, as well. Most biofeedback technologies are what we would call indirect biofeedback technologies, where you put on the band and you go into the computer and you establish a goal. So the goal of the session is to create more alpha or more beta or more theta or whatever. So you set the goal and then you start doing the work, and whenever you reach the goal, you get some kind of feedback from the computer that you've reached the goal. You get a little beep, beep, you've arrived or whatever. But that's a far cry from actually a true direct biofeedback system, to where you're actually being fed back your own self. So in our biofeedback technology like this, a person is actually seeing and hearing and feeling their own energy field. They're not really just getting a notice that they've arrived at some goal. They're actually experiencing themselves on the most basic primary level of reality that is beyond the quantum, in the space where everything originates from, and then it unfolds inside out and manifests over here in direct space. So really the answer to your question is that the whole concept of spirituality and religion is our goal of all of our technology. How do you show a person who they are at their most basic primary level, where they can make changes there? If you make changes on this matrix that you're looking at right now, all you're dealing with is the difference between your real and imaginary components, your actual and potential components. Once that actually gets manifest over here in the real world, it has all kind of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual issues attached to it, and you have to address all of those. So you got to go see the doctor, you got to go see the psychiatrist, you got to go see the spiritual counselor. Whereas on the other side, it's all homogenous. It's just all about you and this difference between your real self and your imaginary self. And if you resolve it over there, then it actually doesn't appear over here. So this kind of technology allows you to kind of get the jump on things before they actually manifest over here, and you got all kind of problems that you got to deal with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's amazing and mind blowing just because I get in the images, and I have a little bit of understanding in most of it. You know, I have some experience in biofeedback. And so all the concepts I'm generally familiar with. It's kind of like a car, you know, I know it has wheels and an engine and a seat and stereo, and you're upgrading every single element of that. You're like, this is how the rubber's designed, but this is the old rubber. This is like brand new, you know, so my mind is trying to catch up to what you're offering. And I think that it's really extraordinary stuff, because I do know that let's say consciousness technologies, spiritual technologies, which we won't use because the scientists out there are like, no, don't use that term. But through biofeedback and brain waves and vibration, we can start to measure these things. And that's how those certain epiphanies happen, like these brainwave states. And so we can use technologies now that will assist us in having those experiences. And once you have that experience, then things really change, and you're starting to change your own reality and your own feedback. And, you know, this life, if anything, is just a feedback loop. You know, if you run out in traffic and, you know, throw a rock at a car, you know, do that 5 times, you're going to get some feedback. But we're getting subtle feedback. And what I really liked about your image there is that I think that most people in the culture, they believe that whatever they're experiencing is so real, and that's all there is to it. And what that chart you're looking at is showing is that, you know, we don't know far more than what we know. And even what we've mapped out is ridiculous. And even just the consciousness it takes to look at this, Matt, is only a fragment of what we actually know is happening. So it's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. And so the mind is never going to be able to figure it out in that way, but it can be experienced. And the technologies, it seems, that you're presenting are allowing us to get into that experiential state. So I guess the question that I'd ask you is, how would somebody if they want to experience some of these technologies, how would they do that? And let's just say I had them in my house. What would be your like training program? Could I have it and it would allow me to, you know, reach these states? Because when we talked privately, we talked about what float tanks do. And you were saying, oh, yeah, I was one of the pioneers of making float tanks. But then I realized that was one element of it. You know, we could do a lot better. So now you've integrated all these other technologies. So I guess I'd ask, just if we want to experience some of these things, how possible is it? I like to max it out, you know, like I like to try to get it as much as I can, go to the gym and do squats and deadlifts and everything that I can. So how could I do that with your technology? And finally, the last question that I'll give, and you can feel free to kind of share whatever else you want to go or share, but what about like personal practices and your like philosophy on life for expanding your own consciousness? Because I'm interviewing these people and this is like beyond me. So I'm just wondering if you're listening to this podcast and you want some practical advice from what you've learned on your journey, you know, how can we use that even, you know, with or without the technologies?
Yeah. Well, you can go on our website, and there's a place on our website where it lists all the locations of people who have this technology around the world. So you may be able to find somebody close that's got our technologies. Our technologies are usually made modular so that they can be used separately from each other instead of just all one system. So a lot of these places will have one technology or a part of the other technology, but you can look through there and see. We also make the technologies available for sale. So on our website, you can go there and you can see that everything that you're seeing here is actually for sale. And we have a lot of these in people's homes. We have them in doctors' offices. We have them in different kinds of centers and spas, different kind of places where self-improvement and that sort of thing are the goal. So there are ways to find people that have the technology that are facilitators. We have a lot of those out here on the West Coast. We don't have so many on the East Coast where you are, but we have a lot of them on the West Coast and in other countries. And so a person can actually go and find an on-site location where they can go and experience this kind of technology. But like I said, we also sell the technology. So I have a lot of people that have these in their homes. And so for, as little as $250, someone can get involved in having some of this technology in their home, all the way up to $30,000 or $40,000 if they want a full-blown system with virtual reality, and all that sort of thing. So it really depends on what the person's really looking for and what their budget is and that sort of thing as to how much of this that they can experience themselves. But as far as my own personal view of all of this and my own personal practice of it is that we've had the technology for so long now that I've basically just become the technology. I basically can sit down anywhere and close my eyes, and I can be in any of those places. And so it's the goal of technology is to learn how to do without the technology. And that's the goal with our technology is they're tools that teach a person how to get into a certain state of mind. But once you learn how to do that, it's like riding a bicycle. You remember how to get there. And so for most of us who have been doing this for quite some time, I still do the vibrasound. It's fun. It's kind of like an altered state. So it's fun to do it. But I really now try to live it in my day-to-day life. I'm beyond being caught in the midst of all the things that are going on. I find myself these days mostly being up above it, all looking down on it and seeing myself relate to other people. So instead of being in a conversation with another person, I'm not only there having the conversation with them, but I'm up here above it watching how I'm reacting to them and watching myself from a higher level. And it's one thing to be aware, but it's another thing to become aware of how you're being aware. And once you learn how to do that, you just kind of start living there. You're not all caught up in it anymore. You're living your life of being aware of how you're being aware. And that allows you a whole different way of dealing with things. So at that point, you can kind of pretty much create your own reality. Because what you really wind up finding out is that everything you say comes true. So you wind up starting to be very careful about what you say. And once you learn how to control yourself and control your responsive to people, and instead of just replying off of the cuff at people based on some kind of emotion that you're having in the moment, if you back off for a second and you think about it, you come up with the perfect thing to say that just takes the whole experience to a whole other level and gets it out of the humdrum day-to-day kind of aspects of things. So you really learn how to create your own reality by paying attention to how you're involved in it all and how you're saying and how you're talking. When people come in to work with me, I ask them to describe their best friend to me, which they can do so with no problems, especially when I further define that. When I say who is a person, I'm talking about the person's manner of being, how they are in the world, and their manner of doing, what they do in the world. So I ask them to describe their friend to me, their best friend, and they can tell me all about their friend. But then when I turn that around and I say, well, okay, so now tell me the same thing about yourself. Most people, even conscious people, most people will say something like, oh, well, I try to be a nice person. I try to be there for people. They just have the hardest time defining themselves, who they are, their manner of being and their manner of doing. What are you doing with your time? They have the hardest time explaining that about themselves, but they can do it about their friends so easily. So it's obvious to me that the main problem in the world is that people don't know who they are. They don't know themselves. How often does a person sit down and look at themselves in the mirror? I know that actors do it every once in a while. But when does a person sit down and experience themselves? The first thing that people say to me when they come up, when they get this technology, when they're, wait a minute, where is it? When they're looking at one of these images. Let me find one here. I don't see it. Here we go. When they're looking at one of these images like that. The first thing that people ask when I put them on this system and they're looking at this about themselves, their first question is, what am I supposed to be doing? And the answer is nothing. You're supposed to be experiencing yourself. But how often we do that, you wouldn't believe how hard it is for people to sit down and just experience themselves. Even when it's in real time. I'll show you the real-time version of the portico. It looks like this. And I want to turn the sound down so it doesn't drown us out. But here you can see that this is actually responding to my voice. If I be quiet for a second, you'll see this settles down. But as I begin to speak, you can see it's actually responding to my voice and picking it up. So the first question is, what am I supposed to be doing? The answer is nothing. You're supposed to just be experiencing yourself. But the interesting thing is that when a person's experiencing themselves like this, they're experiencing themselves on the most primary, basic level of reality. This isn't something up in the future. This isn't a color organ of something that I've just come up with out of nowhere. This is actually their own energy being displayed right in front of them. And if this was done on a person who's never done any work on themselves to order themselves up, the pixels just randomly distribute. But the more work a person's done on themselves, the more patterns start showing up. And you can see a lot of patterns in this one that I'm actually showing you here. This actually looks like a totem pole in here in the middle with a bunch of little faces and all kinds of things on it. But there's also patterning going on out into the outside edges of it as well. So this is really just a 12-dimensional torus. So it really just looks like this. But since we're working with 12 dimensions, to present it like this is kind of a misnomer because you're only seeing the outside dimension. You're not seeing all the inside dimensions. So we actually unfold that. So that they can see the things. Let me find a, close some of this down. I'll show you quickly the, I'm just looking for another program here to show you how this all works. So here we go. So so if I just go back to nothing, we wind up with a 0-dimensional point. But if I add one real component into that, I can turn that zero-dimensional point into a one-dimensional line. If I add one imaginary to that, I can turn that one-dimensional line into a two-dimensional circle. If I add two more imaginaries to that, I can turn that two-dimensional circle into a three-dimensional sphere. And if I add two more, or actually three more imaginaries to that, I can turn that two-dimensional sphere into a four-dimensional torus, and I can torsion it over time like that. So basically what we're doing is we are populating this little vertex in here with a person's 12-dimensional energy. And you have to consider that there are actually 12 of these tori stacked inside of this, and they all go through this little vertex. And so if I unfold that, if I unthread it by just taking it apart right here, you'll see what happens. Let me stop it from torsioning. And then we can unfold it like that. Hold it back up, and then unfold it. So this is what we're actually looking at when you saw those matrices. You're looking at an unfolded 12-dimensional torus that's actually showing all 12 dimensions of that person's reality. And if we take that to the world scale, the world grid, it would look like this. Where is it?
So in a way, when you're experiencing this, you're getting, you know, kind of biofeedback in many different layers, not just in one way, in many ways.
Exactly.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Let's see if I can, it looks like this has disappeared off of my computer. Hold on one second, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so on our supercomputer, it actually has a incubator on there that incubates all the real and the imaginary components that we've discovered from different voices and data mining the internet and all that sort of thing. So whenever we find a real and imaginary ratio that we've never seen before, we toss it into this little incubator. And some of them live and some of them die. So we really consider this incubator to be all of the real and the imaginary ratios that can live in harmony with each other. And this is really what we bleed off of to make the structured water that I was showing you earlier. We bleed off of this incubator to actually make that water. And if you watch this for a while, you actually will begin to see that it kind of seems to be a living kind of organism. It's you see different kind of patterns show up, DNA chains or vessels that blood is shooting through, little tubes. You see different natural phenomenon that that we see in real life. You can see them in this incubator full of these real and imaginary components. So it's really quite, I wish you could see this in real time, because on the internet, the speed, everything slows it down. So to you, it looks like it's jerking. Whereas to me now, it looks like it's flowing smoothly between all of these different stages. And it's really quite spectacular to really see it in full resolution and watch it go through all of its permutations, trying to achieve balance. It's trying to balance itself out between these real and imaginary components. But it can't quite do it because it's a living entity, and every time it comes back to state one, it's a little bit different than it was before because it's growing.
It's mind blowing. It reminds me of that movie with Johnny Depp when he becomes a singularity or whatever that was. It seems like your transcendence. You're kind of like, it seems like the technology you're talking about is moving that way.
Yeah, it truly is. You can actually see in here, you can see all the different kinds of attractors. You can see point attractors and line attractors and toroidal attractors, and then the strange attractor, which we've actually been able to show are the four forces that the physicists see, the strong and the weak force, gravity, and electromagnetism are really just attractors in the chaotic spectrum. So you can start identifying what's going on within a person by looking at what they're attracted to and what kind of holes that they fall into, what kind of things that they go towards or held away from, that sort of thing. You can start seeing that all just in their energy fields.
That's amazing. Well, Don, this has been properly mind-blowing as I knew it was going to be. It's definitely been a privilege and an honor to sit on the other side and get my mind blown. And I know that people on the internet are going to enjoy going through this as well. Is there anything that you would like to talk about more, or that you wish that I asked, even from like a scientific level? Because I wouldn't know the right question to ask in that by any means. So I'm just curious if there's anything else that you'd like to share or wish I'd asked before we change. And feel free to, go as long as you want. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
So I think we've covered the basic idea of what's going on here. I want to show you
Look like one of your little icons is some sort of spaceship guy. Looked awesome. You must have the
this
best.
guy.
Yeah, you must have the best programs on your computer.
This is our latest piece of technology called a sensorium, where you can actually go in and you can program it to create any kind of light show, music, modulate the lights. You can create any kind of frequencies to like 6 decimal points. And one of the good things about our technology is that it's all phase coherent. When other people do vibrational technology, they decide what frequency they're going to use, but then they go over to some other little generator and they punch the button and they generate the frequency out of that particular module. And then if they want to use lights with that, they go over and they turn on their light and sound device. And they try to set the same frequencies in there, but it doesn't work exactly the same because it's impossible to turn them all on and all off at the same time. So they all start at a little bit of different moments. So it's hard to get the phases, the peaks and the valleys of all of the different frequencies lined up correctly. Whereas with this kind of technology, everything's already phase coherent. And when you hit the run button up here, everything starts at exactly the same time. So everything is phase coherent. So you can, I'll show you, you can see this is the spreadsheet of the 107 different parameters of things that you can change and modulate with the system. And you can say, I wanted to do these 107 things for this amount of time. And then I want to make another segment where it does these other 107 things for another amount of time. So you can stack on segments and have like an hour program or a 2-hour program, or whatever you want to work. And by having the technology that synchronizes it all, the therapist only has to hit the run button and then they're free to do the work. So you don't have to sit there and push a bunch of buttons and dial knobs and all of that. It runs the program just naturally. But what I was going
Do you
to
have
say,
some presets on there? Because I wouldn't know even where to begin with all of those
yeah,
options.
the program comes with 21 preset programs. I don't see the other. What I was going to show you. I don't see it. I can show you this, where this actually proves that all geometry is created from real and imaginary components. If you were to go and you were to ask scientists, what's the most basic level of reality? You'll get different ideas from different people. Like some people will say, well, everything is a vibration, so it has to start as a vibration. If you ask Nassim or one of those guys, one of those top New World physicists, they'll most likely say sacred geometry is the most basic level of reality. But we've actually proven that there's a level beyond that. It's called these real and imaginary components, because if I take any one of the sacred geometries, let's take like a square, for example, and drag it up here, you can see that this is a square, but it actually is made up from all these imaginary and real coefficients, actually makes that shape. And that's what that shape looks like in the spectral domain instead of the time domain. The spectral domain is actually the center of a lens, like you've seen it before, where you've seen a image of a light going through a lens and how it crosses over in the center of the lens. But in that center of the lens, some amazing things are happening there that no one's ever really talked about. That's called the spectral domain. And that's what that square looks like going through the center of a lens. And you can see all of the real and the imaginary coefficients that make up that shape. If I drive in, this is an icosahedra, if I drag that in there, you can see that it has a whole different set of real and imaginary coefficients. And this is the image that it makes. So basically, the US government gave us a patent on what creates geometry. Even though it was over their head and they couldn't really understand what it was all about. But this is how basic we are now into reality is that we know that the basic, most underlying structure of all reality are these real and imaginary coefficients. And I guess I can end this by saying our major discovery about what this is kind of mind-blowing, because if you're listening to a person play an instrument like a violin, part of what you're hearing is coming from the violin, but part is coming from the player. So part of it's coming from the resonant cavities in the strings and everything of the violin. And it always sounds like that particular violin. A professional could listen to 10 different people playing that same instrument, and they could say, without doubt, they say they're all playing the same instrument because that instrument has its own sound. But the way in which it's played is totally different. So what that boils down to is that is the real and the imaginary components. The real components are coming from the player, whereas the imaginary components are coming from the instrument. So this is a major discovery and a major realization when somebody really understands what that means, that we are the same thing as a musical composition. We live inside of this instrument, but we're also the player of the instrument. I could keep talking and leave that part out, but I'd sound like one of those guys in Battlestar Galactica who's really a computer and has no inflection in the voice. Or I can make my voice really passionate, but that's really coming from how I'm thinking and feeling about what I'm talking about. It's not really coming from my body or my resonant cavities. And so these real and imaginary coefficients represent the player and the instrument. Doesn't that make so much sense? It's just a player and an instrument. And when you hear me talk right now, part of what you're hearing is coming from my instrument, my resonant cavity, my vocal cords. The part of it's coming from how I'm thinking and feeling about what I'm talking about. And the difference between those two is the source of all human problems. All human issues stem from the difference between these real and imaginary coefficients. And you can look around in nature and you can see that any time that the personal aspects of something are better integrated with the impersonal aspects, the outcome is better. So between a player and an instrument, or between an operator and a machine, or between a driver and a vehicle, anytime the integration is better between those, the outcome is better. And so that's really basically what we're up to here with our technology, is we're giving people technology where they can observe themselves and experience themselves on the most primary level of reality and start learning how to better integrate their instrument with their player. And that's the bottom line of it all.
It's amazing. Oh my goodness. Well, Don, that was amazing. And I'm glad you definitely extended this last part, because I don't even know what I'm looking at, but it's fascinating. And I'm sure you could probably give me like 2 hours on that, but I understand the general gist of it, which is really fascinating. I guess I could close it, but now I am curious. I'll just ask your quick thoughts, and you can again feel free to expand. But it looks like you're closing in on the nature of reality. Like you're looking at what is real, like what is actually real. From when I'm looking at it, I've heard that particles disappear and reappear when you're trying to narrow them down, so it goes smaller than small. Does this go into simulation theory with you, or where have you come to the conclusion of like what this reality is and like what the purpose of it is?
It goes beyond that reality that you're talking about, because you're still talking about primary particles, and if you follow that, you wind up with the string theory. You wind up with the fact that all those primary particles are just little string, and depending on how they're vibrating and all of those different dimensions, they become electrons or protons or whatever the primary particle might be. But in reality, those are just all part of intention, and how intention has the ability to reach across the quantum veil to the other side in reciprocal space and deal with those real and imaginary components. And the second that it adds them together, a sine wave or a cosine wave shows up over here on this side. So this is how intention becomes real, is that little strings get formed from our thoughts. And those strings come together and they weave themselves together like threads in a fabric until something appears over here. So if it's some thought that you have that's just a passing thought and you say at one time, then not really much happens. Those kind of strings kind of they appear and they disappear. But if it's something that you harp on all the time, if it's a mantra that you say over and over and over and over again, then those little strings start weaving themselves together, and sooner or later, something manifests over here in the real world that maybe you did or did not want. So it really boils down to being very careful what you say. It's one thing to think things. It's actually okay to think anything you want, and it maybe only causes some internal problems. But the second that you express that thought, you shrug your shoulders, or you roll your eyes, or you make some kind of statement to express the thought that you're having, it actually sets into motion these real and imaginary components. And they start coming together, and they create sine waves and cosine waves, which are these little strings that the string theorists are always talking about. And those things start weaving themselves together into fabrics and into realities. So again, you have to be really very careful what you say, because almost indelibly those will come back to manifest themselves.
Awesome. Well,
And that's really the bottom line of it, of all of it. Be careful what you say.
I appreciate that. Well, Don, it has been a privilege. It's been an honor. My brain is hurting, but I can't wait to explore more of these technologies and definitely give a bunch of try. I've tried a whole bunch of different things like light therapy, vibrasound, but it seems like you've got like the Ferrari version of all that. So I'm definitely excited to dive in. Where can people find more about you or contact you if they wish to?
Well, the website, there's several websites. One is just vibrasound.com, vibrasound.com. In fact, I think maybe I have it here where they can actually see it. So there's my information. There's our address, the phone number, the emails, and the websites. And a person can find about us on that. You can. I was really surprised just to go in and type my name into a search engine. You get a lot of, I've been around for a long time, so there's a lot that shows up there. There's a lot that's on YouTube and things like that, of workshops that I've done and things like that. So there's all kind of ways to find out about our work. And about, just to address what you were saying earlier, I mean, we've just kind of covered the surface here. But if you look at the left-hand column here of all these slides, every one of these slides has important information on it about what we're talking about. And so these slides basically go through my chart. And I had promised everybody who bought one of my charts that I would do a little workshop on explaining it. But when I started out trying to do that, I realized it was really a whole course in vibrational science. And so over the next couple of weeks, I will be publishing this on my website. I have all of the slides done, but I haven't done the voiceovers on it yet. But you can see that there's a lot of information there that goes way beyond what we're talking about here about frequency and vibration and stuff, but it goes into all kind of spiritual realities and how it all relates to more important things than just the science of it.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, I'm excited to see that course myself. So definitely send me a link and maybe, well, I'm sure it's going to be a pretty big course, but maybe we'll come back and you can figure out once you go through what would be most important to share for a round two, because it's deep, it's dense, it's exciting. But I'm grateful for you and the work that you're doing. And just thank you so much for coming on.
It's been my pleasure. And I look forward to getting back with you some more about talking about the more usable meanings and values to understanding this kind of technology. It's one thing to understand the science of it. It's another thing to apply it into our day-to-day lives. And so learning how to separate the animal self from the spiritual self and realizing that those are two different selves. And just that realization alone is enough to get a person started off in the right direction about knowing that they get to choose between those two options. And it's not to say that the animal is bad and the spirit is wrong. It's just about to say that there's a way to combine those into one thing so that they both get what they want out of it rather than just one or the other.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm definitely, and I love the way that you phrase that. That's definitely one of my notes. It's so fascinating. I can think about the scenario just in playing out in my life, like the animal self. I think when I use the example, like I say, like I'm like really masculine, or like I just say I'm a caveman, and I feel like that's just like I have a very strong animal self, and it makes a lot more sense that way. A very strong, like primitive animalistic side that I try not to give into, but I don't always achieve that. So it's a really good way to put it, I think, and it gives that free will choice. You're understanding what you're choosing between, and I think that gives freedom. And I like how you say it's the sandwich of consciousness in the middle. So yeah, I would love to dive deeper on that for sure.
All right. Well, I'm here whenever you're ready for it. We'll go at it again. And I'll put some thought into what would be the next thing that we would talk about. What would be the next thing that would be interesting to your listeners.
Sounds good. Well, I appreciate you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll get you on as soon as we can. Again.
Thank you. All right. Thanks again.
See you, Don.
All right.